Well, we already know there's a whole lot of things discussed within the walls of the White House that we don't know about. But it seems there are a series of secret wars that have been waged as part of a program started by President George W. Bush and continued with vigor by President Obama. It's called the Olympic Games, and one example of this came in the form of a cyber worm that outsiders referred to as Stuxnet. It was sent into Iran a couple years ago to disrupt certain aspects of their nuclear program. Well, it turns out the U.S. and Israel were behind that. They developed it, carried it out. So, are you surprised? Well, you shouldn't be, because we've been telling you about this for more than a year now. And David Sanger of the New York Times is now saying it as well. His article published today says, quote, "It appears to be the first time the United States has repeatedly used cyber weapons to cripple another country's infrastructure, achieving with computer code what until then could only be accomplished by bombing a country or sending in agents to plant explosives." So let's talk a little bit more about this, not just the cyber attacks, but also the message that we as citizens have been hearing from those on the inside. It's a message very different than what turns out has actually been happening. So let's go now to Declan McCullagh, Chief Political Correspondent for CNet. Hey there, Declan. I guess first, I just want to get your reaction to this news that it was, in fact, the U.S. and Israel behind Stuxnet and other similar programs.
I first wanted to say that this is very good reporting by David Sanger, who's at the New York Times' Washington bureau. I think he's their chief D.C. correspondent. It's part of a book he has coming out next week, and it's the Times is running it. So it's really nicely done. My reaction: this is what we thought was the case. Everyone had pretty much assumed that it's the U.S. and/or Israel probably working together. What we didn't know was that this was a program put in place by George W. Bush, and then President Obama continued it. So the details, especially the White House's involvement, we didn't know. But U.S.-Israel, yeah, that was the general assumption before today.
Yeah, certainly an interesting article by David Sanger. It seems this is just a small portion of some of what he's learned in terms of the number of secret wars that have been going on. Of course, we saw also in the New York Times a week ago about Obama's kill list. What do you make of this, Declan, that so much is going on inside the White House, and now it is technology-based?
Well, what I would like, this is more as a voter, a citizen than a journalist even, is if we're going to declare war on someone, last I checked, the U.S. Constitution gives the Congress, the legislative branch, the power to declare war. So we're talking about cyber war, we're talking about drone wars, but these can't be wars unless Congress declares them. But we have a declared war in Vietnam and Korea and so on. So this is, I'm in a minority here, but if there's war, I'd like it to at least follow the constitutional process. That's my first take. The second take is we're going to see much more of the same. Once you give the executive branch this kind of power, they like it. According to the New York Times piece, this is one of the two programs, well, the second being the drone program, that President Bush told his successor that, yeah, you got to keep this one going.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I don't know, Declan, if you are in the minority. I think a lot of people are a little murky on all the details and don't really understand how many times certain wars have been launched. Of course, calling it war, a lot of times, you know, the executive branch just sort of gets around it by calling it something else. Let's move on, though. You know, it's interesting to me because based on what many of our leaders have been telling us, we should be afraid of this thing happening to us, of other countries launching cyber attacks on our internet. Just for a second, Declan, I want to play a few examples.
A weapon of mass disruption.
You could have a cyber attack that would be as consequential in terms of the economy, and maybe even in terms of loss of life, as things we typically associate with war fighting.
Next Pearl Harbor that we confront could very well be a cyber attack that cripples our power systems, our grid.
Acts of terror could come not only from a few extremists in suicide vests, but from a few keystrokes on the computer.
So, I mean, do you think it's interesting at all, Declan, that everything that we've been warned about is actually, you know, by our government is actually what our government is doing?
Well, I'm not sure the U.S. is the worst offender in that case, in this respect. A lot of governments, probably every government, says, "Oh, look at these bad things happening over there," and internally, let's not worry too much about privacy and free speech. Let's just complain about everyone else. But this is an interesting situation when you have the government able to, or let me rephrase that, the U.S. was the first nation, as far as we know, to launch a cyber attack against an infrastructure. But it's not going to be the last. And does infrastructure mean your neighborhood water or sewage processing plant? Is it electricity? I don't know. But I mean, if I was an Iranian government official, and now this is virtually confirmed in the New York Times that the president was involved, I might want to get a bit of revenge, and maybe some civilian targets in the U.S. are a little less armored than, say, military targets would be. This is going to be an interesting next few years.
Absolutely, and I do think it's important when we talk about situations like this, to show that perspective, that Iranian perspective. So I want to play really quick something that the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson said.
This is an electronic war by the enemies of Iran that can be listed under their attempts to prevent Iran from acquiring peaceful nuclear power. But it's a failure attempt, as not a single part of the Bashar facility was affected or harmed by the virus, and it was destroyed completely.
So here we have on one hand, what's happening, these cyber attacks, and then we have sort of how it's interpreted, how that information is put out to the people. They seem to be denying that this even happened.
Well, I think it's, I mean, it's difficult to get facts because you're relying as a journalist on unnamed sources, anonymous sources, and you're dealing with governments and propaganda on probably all sides. But it seems likely that the Stuxnet malware did accomplish its intended result, at least to some extent. How quickly the Iranians were able to get things back online, how much of an impact it really had, I don't know. But it did have some impact. I think, and if it had an impact, is that an act of war?
I think that's an important point. A lot of people reading this article, perhaps surprised, perhaps even saying, well, there's a little hypocrisy there. Not a lot of people bummed out that the U.S. is using technology to interfere with the nuclear program, or so-called nuclear program in Iran. It's interesting, Declan, here in Washington, in Congress, it seems the timing is pretty good because a lot of lawmakers are currently asking for more funding, more money to go to fund cybersecurity. The executive branch, in the courts right now, we're seeing the executive branch wanting to get out of following certain rules under, security and secrecy because they need, to be able to do what they need to do without revealing these state secrets. So do you think that as more and more reports like this come out, as David Sanger's book comes out, that this is only going to bolster the cause and help the case of those trying to make cybersecurity more of an issue here?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, we've talked about this before. If you look at the incentives, and it's always useful to look at incentives in political debates. If you're a government official and you have an incentive to exaggerate the threat, so you get a larger budget. If you're a Homeland Security contractor about Beltway Bandit, you have an incentive to exaggerate this, so then you can get a contract. And so there's a lot of exaggeration going on, and some of the proposals being put forward. I mean, CISPA and the House of Representatives approved it. It's probably dead in the Senate, but the Senate has its own bill with its own problems. I mean, but because you have members of Congress who are not computer scientists, do not understand the technology, who do they believe? Do they believe the generals? Do they believe the contractors? And this is why we're seeing, one reason why we're seeing some of this bad legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. Declan McCullagh, always good to talk to you. Declan is the chief political correspondent for CNet. Always good to see you.